you think about Dracula movies, the most obvious example in recent memory is Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 version, which ambitiously attempted to adapt all 418 pages of Bram Stoker's novel into a 2-hour film. It was actually pretty groundbreaking in how it was made, eschewing all CGI and green screen effects in favor of practical techniques that had already become a lost art by that point in time. So visually, it has a timeless quality that makes it stand out amongst its contemporaries. Narratively, however, it's a bit of a mess, jumping from location to location, introducing too many characters, and where we see Keanu Reeves start out as the protagonist, only to be replaced halfway through by Anthony Hopkins. It's a great example of the pitfalls of attempting to be too faithful to the source material when making a film based on a lengthy novel, which is why I found The Last Voyage of the Demeter to be an intriguing idea, taking the alternative approach by focusing on a single chapter instead, the captain's log of the ship that transports Dracula to England. The original chapter is less than 2,000 words, so the filmmakers were faced with the opposite problem, inventing a new cast of characters and dramatic events to justify the concept. The most notable addition being the new main character, a black doctor who's recently graduated from Cambridge, who's depressed and looking for meaning in life. But is it possible to make a good Dracula movie by adapting a single chapter from the novel? Well, let's put on our strings of garlic and life jackets and find out what happens in Dracula's latest cinematic outing at sea. So the story begins in Whitby in 1897, where the Coast Guard and police discover a ship has beached itself during a storm in the night. An officer reports he found no one alive on board, but his face suggests he didn't find a ghost ship either, and his superior takes the captain's log he's clutching to read the final entry in the log, issuing a warning to whoever finds it that some pretty dark shit went down. We then transition 4 weeks previously to when the Demeter was in the port of Varna, Bulgaria, where we see Romanian gypsies arriving carrying huge crates on horse-drawn wagons. They refuse to help load the crates onto the ship, however, saying they need to leave before sunset, and they give the sailors back all the money they were paid for transporting them all the way from Transylvania to Bulgaria. Nothing suspicious about that. We then meet Clemens, a Cambridge graduated doctor who's down on his luck, who offers himself to join the crew to return back to England when he hears new hands are being recruited, citing his medical and astronomy skills, but he's turned down for not being a sailor. But when loading the crates, an ominous-looking seal on one of them freaks out one of the newly hired men, so much so that he loses concentration, and the crate almost lands on top of the cabin boy and Captain's grandson, Toby. But Clemens saves him just in time, so he's invited to take the superstitious man's place and joins the crew. During dinner, they talk about how they'll spend their wages, as they're told they'll earn a sizable bonus if they reach London early. But Clemens says he doesn't care about money and just wants to understand and make sense of the world. Don't we all, sir? Don't we all? Meanwhile, below decks, they discover one of the crates has fallen open, and from within a big heap of dirt, out pops an unconscious woman, who Clemens diagnoses as being infected with something, and gives her a blood transfusion to save her life. The crew are freaked out, however, and think her presence is a bad omen. Then, during the night watch, one of the crew sees something in his telescope, some kind of demon, and they discover the ship's dog, along with all the animals intended to be slaughtered for meals, are dead. Clemens, being a man of science, believes the dog must have had rabies and bit them all before dying of the disease himself. But not everyone's convinced. Then, during the next night, night, the crewman on watch finds a gaping hole in the barrier that separates the cargo area, and this is where we first see Dracula, depicted entirely in beast form, who kills the crewman, and the next day there's no sign of him anywhere to be seen, and the crew searches the ship. The woman wakes up and tells Clemens her name is Anna, and that she comes from Transylvania, where she lives below a castle belonging to an evil entity that pretends to be a man, who comes out at night to feed on the blood of the innocent, and that the elders of her people gave her to him to feed on as a bargain. He is called Dracula. Now, without going any further, it might be pretty obvious how things continue to play out from here, which leads me to the biggest problem I had with this film. The plot is so bloody simple and predictable. Despite us knowing what happens to the ship in the end, everything in the interim plays out exactly as you would expect, with hardly any unexpected twists or turns. The director, André Øvredal, described the film as basically Alien on a ship in 1897, which highlights why the film doesn't work as well as it could, as Dracula is only depicted as a demonic beast in a slasher film, and might as well be a xenomorph, which just seems like a massive missed opportunity, like making a werewolf film with only the wolf, or having Mr. Hyde without Dr. Jekyll, as surely the most interesting aspect of Dracula is seeing both his human and vampire forms, compounded by the fact that, unlike Alien, none of the characters are memorable, and it's almost impossible to tell the crew apart. Even Clemens is one note, and certainly no Ripley. And although the film tells us he's a victim of racism, it's never actually shown except for one brief remark. And I can't understand why the filmmakers went to the trouble of setting up his backstory to do absolutely nothing with it. It would have made the human drama far more intense if we'd seen the Victorian sailors realistically react to the presence of an unknown black academic, as members of their crew mysteriously vanish, perhaps singling him out, ganging up on him, tying him up, or offering him as a sacrifice to whatever they think is killing them. I don't know. Something. But literally nothing comes of it. Another issue is the lack of rising tension as the voyage continues. The crew only marginally grows more agitated, but we never see scenes of them losing sleep or descending into madness as their numbers dwindle. Aside from perhaps the captain, after losing his son, the characters react as if they know they're in a Dracula movie. I was expecting to see the captain struggling to maintain order and navigate the storm with a skeleton crew driven to the brink, with scenes depicting the unraveling chain of command and increasingly desperate attempts to survive. But we don't really. There's also no sense of the crew actively sailing the ship, which seems to be on autopilot the entire time, with storms only happening in the background, and we never see the sailors working together to navigate them. And unlike the 1992 film, it's visually dull. Even in daylight, things look bland and colourless, whereas surely the key to horror films where bad things take place at night is to make the daytime look bright and vibrant, to heighten the nighttime terror. But everything just feels artificial and stage-bound, with a CGI ship on a CGI ocean, where the actors were probably just standing against green screens the entire time without spending any actual time at sea. Which is ironic, because the screenwriter was inspired to write the script after seeing the model used for the Demeter in the 1992 film. And if you're wondering why it took him such a long time to write it, it's because the screenplay's been floating around Hollywood for the last 20 years. But it wasn't until 2019 that André Øvredal finally finished the film. And although only the original writer and final screenwriter get on-screen credit, the 5 other uncredited writers who touched the script were granted additional literary material acknowledgement for their contributions. So surely after being written and rewritten by 7 different writers and developed over 20 years, it must be an amazing script that's sure to be a box office hit, right? Whoops! It's not just the movie's fault, however, as its marketing's been completely mismanaged, being released only a few months after Renfield and drawing summer, when surely waiting till Halloween would have made more sense. And then there's the title, missing the key word needed to let audiences know it's a Dracula film, because surely everyone's familiar with the novel's 7th chapter, Cutting from the Daily Graph, right? Right? And worst of all, it doesn't even have a definitive ending, but ends on a cliffhanger that shamelessly attempts to set up a sequel. However, as strange as this might sound after everything I've said, I'd still love to see the sequel to this film, as then the filmmakers would be forced to cast Dracula as a human character. And it would be interesting to see what direction they take the story. Would they just adapt the next chapter? Unfortunately, we'll never find out. Ultimately, the film's biggest failure, though, is that, as a horror movie, it's just not very scary, with only repetitive jump scares that lacks a truly suspenseful atmosphere, featuring a cast of generic characters that squanders a great concept by omitting the character of Dracula from his own film to make a predictable, paint-by-numbers horror movie that is fundamentally a forgettable experience.